I want you, the person listening to this deep dive right now, to just pause for a second.
All right, just take a moment.
Yeah, think about the physical device you are using to hear our voices.
Hmm.
You know, whether it's a phone in your hand or a pair of headphones over your ears or maybe a speaker sitting on your desk.
Exactly.
Beneath that sleek plastic or the brushed aluminum, there is a hidden metallic skeleton. And the atoms currently vibrating inside that device, the ones carrying the electrical current that translates into the sound of my voice right now. Well, those atoms might literally be older than the solar system itself.
Which is, I mean, that's just a staggering reality to confront.
It really is.
Because those specific atoms were forged in the heart of dying stars. They were scattered across the cosmos and then eventually compressed into the crust of our planet. And materially speaking, the atoms inside your headphones right now are identical to the atoms in a Bronze Age sword
Wow.
or, a Victorian telegraph wire or a Roman water pipe.
They are the exact same material?
Completely identical.
Mhm. And that's our mission today. We are tracking humanity's red thread. Because you look at the drywall in your house, and it's easy to just, I don't know, assume the wires behind it are these mundane, disposable things.
Right, just stuff you buy at a hardware store.
Exactly. But if you actually want to find the structural skeleton of the modern world, you don't look for concrete or steel. You look for this singular red metal. From ancient mythology to the brutal realities of human labor, all the way to the absolute center of our future green energy grid, copper.
It demands a total shift in how we perceive the world. We tend to view resources as things we simply consume.
Sure, we mine them, we burn them, we throw them away.
Right. But copper is different. Copper is a relationship we inhabit. I mean, it is the physical medium of our civilization.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how this one specific element gained that kind of planetary dominance, we really have to start at the absolute ground floor, the atomic and geological level.
The very beginning.
Right. We need to talk about the personality of this metal. Before humans ever even touched it, how did it physically get into the Earth's crust in a way that we could eventually find it?
Well, to find the origin of copper deposits on Earth, you have to look deep underground into these tectonically active regions. And you really have to think in immense geological timescales.
Like how long?
Hundreds of thousands, or even millions of years, deep within the Earth, where massive tectonic plates collide and grind against each other. The immense heat it melts the rock into magma.
Right.
And as this magma churns and slowly rises toward the crust, copper and other elements become heavily concentrated within that molten stew.
I always try to picture the sheer violence of that environment. It's just an unimaginable crush of pressure and heat. But how does it go from being mixed up in a giant sea of underground magma to forming those distinct concentrated veins of pure copper, the ones that miners actually dig up?
Yeah, so the mechanism is this fascinating geological process called magmatic hydrothermal formation.
Magmatic hydrothermal?
Right. So as that massive body of magma slowly cools deep underground, the water that was trapped inside the molten rock starts to separate from it. But, and this is key, this isn't water as we experience it on the surface.
It's not a gentle underground stream.
Not at all. We are talking about superheated, highly pressurized fluids that easily exceed 400 degrees Celsius.
Wait, 400 degrees, so that's water that is 4 times hotter than boiling, but it can't turn into steam because, the physical weight of the Earth's crust is just crushing down on it?
Precisely. The pressure is immense, and because of that extreme temperature and pressure, this water acts as an incredibly aggressive solvent.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it literally dissolves the trace metals, including copper, straight out of the surrounding cooling magma. So now you have this intensely hot, highly acidic metallic fluid.
Wow.
And then the immense pressure forces this fluid to shoot upward through any available cracks, faults, or weak points in the solid rock above.
It's like the Earth's crust is cracking and this subterranean metallic geyser is just being injected into the fractures.
Exactly. And as those superheated fluids migrate closer to the surface, the environment starts to change. The surrounding rock is cooler, the pressure drops.
Because it's getting shallower.
Right. And because the fluid is cooling down, it can no longer keep those heavy metals dissolved. The chemistry shifts. So the copper minerals begin to crystallize and precipitate out of the water, clinging directly to the walls of those cracks.
That makes sense.
And over millions of years, as this process repeats and the tectonic systems evolve, you get these massive concentrations. You get brilliant veins of copper winding through the rock. You get disseminated deposits where the metal is scattered through the stone like seeds and massive sulfide bodies.
So the planet basically spends millions of years concentrating it for us.
Yes, exactly.
But to really grasp why humanity built our entire technological existence on this specific metal, we have to zoom in even further, past the rock, past the veins, all the way down to the atomic structure.
The atomic level is where it all happens.
Right, because copper has 29 protons. And in the notes we gathered for this deep dive, there's this specific sequence that dictates its electron configuration. It's argon 3d10 4s1.
Yeah, that sequence, specifically that final part of 4s1, that is the key to everything copper does. So an atom has a nucleus in the center, right? And electrons orbit around it in different shells or layers.
Okay.
Copper's 29th electron, that single outer electron, the fourth shell, is incredibly loosely bound to the nucleus.
Meaning the nucleus isn't holding on to it very tightly, it's just sort of like hovering out there on the edge.
It's highly mobile. When you put a bunch of copper atoms together, those loose outer electrons actually detach from their individual parent atoms.
Really? They just let go?
They do. They form what physicists call an electron sea. They just flow freely throughout the solid metal. And this is what gives copper its exceptional electrical and thermal conductivity.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, when you apply a voltage to a copper wire, those free-floating electrons instantly drift through the metal, carrying the electrical charge.
You know, I always think of that single, loosely bound outer electron like a highly social, extroverted friend at a party.
A party. Okay, I like that.
Yeah, you know the type. They show up, but they aren't tied down to one conversation or one group in the corner. They're incredibly eager to move around the room, mingle, and just share energy with everyone.
Right.
They just want to connect. And that chemical extroversion is exactly what makes copper the perfect conduit for electricity. It just wants to pass the charge along.
That is a remarkably accurate visualization, actually. Because of that willingness to share electrons, copper's electrical conductivity is monumental. It's measured at 5.96 times 10 to the 7th Siemens per meter.
Which is a lot.
It's massive. Under standard conditions, there's only one element on the periodic table that conducts electricity better, and that is silver.
Silver, but silver is astronomically rare and expensive.
Exactly. You cannot wire a global power grid with silver. It would bankrupt the world. So copper sits in this perfect chemical sweet spot.
But it's not just about how it moves energy, right? It's also about how it physically holds together. Because if you try to hammer a piece of crystal, it shatters.
Right.
If you try to hammer a piece of cast iron without heating it to blazing temperatures, it cracks. But copper is different. The sources describe it as having a face-centered cubic crystal structure.
The face-centered cubic structure, or FCC, this dictates how the copper atoms stack together in a solid state.
Okay, how does that work?
Imagine pouring a box of perfectly smooth marbles into a glass cube. The way those marbles naturally settle into the tightest possible arrangement, resting in the little grooves between the marbles below them, that is very similar to an FCC structure.
Okay, I'm picturing the marbles, but how does that explain why a copper wire bends instead of snaps?
Well, because of the symmetry and density of that specific arrangement, the layers of atoms have multiple flat planes. When physical force is applied, say a blacksmith hitting it with a hammer or a machine pulling it through a die down, entire planes of atoms can smoothly slide past one another without the metallic bonds between them breaking.
Oh, so the structure just rearranges itself instead of fracturing.
Exactly. It yields to the pressure.
Yeah.
This is what makes copper highly malleable, meaning you can hammer it into incredibly thin sheets. And it's highly ductile, meaning you can draw it out into miles of incredibly thin wire.
That's amazing.
It's very dense and heavy. It weighs 8.96 grams per cubic centimeter, but it has a Mohs hardness of only about 3. It's quite soft.
And that softness is the crucial turning point for human history. Because if the best metal on Earth was as hard and stubborn as iron, early humans wouldn't have been able to do a single thing with it.
No, they wouldn't have the technology.
Right. To get iron to behave, you need massive blast furnaces, you need advanced industrial chemistry, you have to achieve temperatures that a simple wood fire just cannot produce. But copper was accessible.
It was. Iron is almost always found locked up in tight chemical bonds with oxygen or sulfur inside rocks. You have to chemically rip it apart. Copper, conversely, can be found in a native metallic state.
Native meaning just pure metal.
Exactly. Early humans literally found pure chunks of elemental metallic copper just sitting in the dirt. No smelting required at all.
Or they found those incredibly vivid ores. If you've ever seen these in a museum, they don't look like normal rocks. You have malachite, which is this striking, vibrant green, azurite, which is a deep, glowing blue, and cuprite, which is a rich red.
Those visual markers were vital. Early humans walking through a landscape didn't need a degree in metallurgy to notice a bright blue or neon green rock outcropping. The metal practically announced itself.
And think about the psychology of that moment for an ancient human. Your entire world up to that point is stone, wood, and bone.
Right.
You hit a piece of flint with another rock, and it chips, it fractures. But then you find this heavy green rock. You hit it, and it doesn't chip, it dents.
Yes.
You hit it again, and it flattens, it bends. You realize you can shape it without removing material. You're not just finding tools anymore, you're transforming matter.
Which takes us across a massive threshold in human development. We enter the Chalcolithic era, the Copper-Stone transition.
Although, calling it an era makes it sound like everyone just woke up one Tuesday, threw their stone axes in the river, and started forging copper tools.
Yeah, it wasn't quite like that.
Right, that's not how it happened at all.
Far from it. The adoption of copper was highly uneven and profoundly slow. We see evidence of early copper use in eastern Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, dating back to around 6500 BCE.
Wow, that long ago.
Yes. But for a very long time, it didn't replace stone for heavy labor.
Because pure copper is too soft. That Mohs hardness of 3 means a pure copper axe head is going to dull incredibly fast if you try to chop down an oak tree.
It's completely impractical for heavy agriculture or felling timber. So initially, copper was mostly a prestige material. It was used for small awls, decorative pins, beads, and jewelry. It was a status symbol.
I see.
Owning a copper object proved that you, or someone in your trade network, possessed this highly specialized, almost magical knowledge of how to manipulate fire and stone to create a shiny, immortal material.
It was the ultimate luxury good. But human ambition is never satisfied with just making jewelry. If pure copper was too soft to conquer the physical world, they had to figure out how to make it harder. And that leads to one of the most consequential scientific discoveries of the ancient world.
Alloying.
Yes.
They discovered that if you melt copper and mix in a small percentage of a different metal, specifically tinnery, the resulting combination is not just a little bit harder, it is vastly superior to pure copper in almost every way.
It's a total game changer.
Absolutely. It holds a razor-sharp edge, it casts beautifully into complex molds, and it doesn't corrode easily. They invented bronze.
And the leap to bronze is what truly redefines civilization. We're talking superior swords, durable armor, interlocking chariot fittings, reliable agricultural plows. But here's where my mind gets completely stuck.
Oh.
Yeah, we talk about the Bronze Age like it was just a technological shift. But looking at the sources we went through, it seems like it was actually a massive logistical nightmare.
Oh, it was arguably the first great logistical era of human history. Because the fundamental problem with bronze is geological. Copper is relatively common, but tin is incredibly rare.
Right.
And they're almost never found in the same place.
So if you're a king sitting in the Eastern Mediterranean and you have mountains of copper, you still can't make a single bronze sword without tin. So where do you get it?
You have to look incredibly far afield. Some tin came from Central Asia, from regions near modern-day Afghanistan.
That's a massive distance.
It is. And later, it was sourced all the way from Cornwall in the British Isles.
Wait, really? All the way from Britain to the Mediterranean?
Exactly. Consider the scale of that.
Yeah.
To equip an army with bronze weaponry in the ancient Near East, you had to establish, protect, and maintain supply chains that spanned thousands of miles across hostile seas and rugged terrain.
That completely flips how I view an ancient artifact. When you look at a Bronze Age sword in a museum, you're not just looking at a weapon. You are looking at physical proof of a massive, complex international network. That sword represents maritime shipping, generations of merchants, diplomatic treaties, translations between different languages, and systems of credit and trust. To have bronze, you literally had to have a globalized supply chain.
Copper made geography intensely political. The island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean became such a dominant powerhouse of copper mining and exportation that the Roman name for the metal As, cyprium, meaning metal of Cyprus, eventually evolved into the Latin word cuprum.
Cuprum.
Yes, which is where we get the English word copper and its elemental symbol on the periodic table, cup.
And the Metropolitan Museum of Art notes that pure copper was traded across the Mediterranean in these massive, heavy slabs called oxide ingots.
Right, they were cast into the shape of an ox's hide, essentially a large rectangle with 4 protruding handles at the corners.
Like it was stretched out.
Yes, But this wasn't just decorative. It was highly functional. A heavy ingot with 4 handles is much easier for 2 dock workers to lift, carry onto a ship, and stack tightly in a cargo hold. It was the ancient equivalent of standardized shipping containers.
That is brilliant. And this wasn't just a Mediterranean phenomenon. Over in China, during the Shang and Zhou dynasties, the mastery of bronze reached an artistic and political peak that is almost hard to comprehend today.
The piece mold casting techniques developed in ancient China allowed for the creation of massive, incredibly intricate bronze vessels. And these weren't everyday cooking pots. They were central to elite rituals and ancestral worship.
So it was deeply tied to their religion and politics.
Absolutely. The state's ability to command the labor to mine the copper and tin, transport it, and command the artisans to cast these monumental vessels that became the literal physical proof of a ruler's mandate from heaven. Metal solidified the concept of kingship and social hierarchy.
Okay, but let me push back on this narrative of the Bronze Age for a second.
Sure.
The classic historical line is that the invention of bronze caused these massive trade networks to form. But looking at human nature, I really have to ask, did the metal cause the globalization? Or did the human desire for globalization, the urge to explore, to trade, to conquer, did that force early humans to figure out how to make bronze? Were we already connecting and bronze was just the reward?
Well, the historical reality is a constant coevolution of materials and ambition. Humans desired better tools to secure resources and dominate their environment, right?
Right.
That ambition drove them to seek out rare materials. The act of seeking tin forced them to build sturdier ships and establish reliable trade routes. Those routes brought disparate cultures into contact, which accelerated the sharing of metallurgical techniques.
So they fed into each other.
Exactly. The metal didn't force humanity to build ships. Human ambition drove the exploration, and the material properties of copper and tin rewarded that ambition with unprecedented power. If a society lacked access to that network, they were left holding stone tools while their neighbors marched in wearing bronze armor.
Which is a terrifying reality if you're on the outside of that network. So we have this metal-building empires, arming soldiers, and solidifying kingship. But as civilization expands, copper undergoes another massive shift.
It does.
It stops being just the metal of the elite, and it becomes the literal and metaphorical currency of everyday life. How does it wire the ancient world long before electricity is even a concept?
To understand that transition, you have to look at everyday economics. Kings and emperors hoarded gold and silver. But gold is rare, and its value is too high for daily use. I mean, you can't buy a loaf of bread with a gold bar.
Right, you'd need a microscopic shaving of it.
Exactly. Copper, however, was abundant enough to be accessible, but difficult enough to process that it held intrinsic value. It was durable, highly divisible, and universally recognized.
It's the metal of the common people, the metal of the marketplace.
Precisely. Copper coins and later bronze and brass coins allowed ordinary localized market life to function efficiently across vast empires. It wasn't just in their pockets, it was in their infrastructure.
Like the Romans.
Yes. The Roman Empire utilized lead for many pipes, but they also used immense quantities of copper and its alloys for valves, fittings, architectural accents, and military hardware. And fast forward to medieval and early modern Europe, and copper took on a civic role.
In what way?
Well, if a city was prosperous and stable, they signaled that wealth by roofing their cathedrals and public buildings with copper.
Because it doesn't rust away. It survives. But the most profound infrastructural leap, the one that fundamentally shapes the world we live in at this exact second, happens when we finally figure out how to manipulate that single extroverted outer electron we talked about earlier. The communication revolution.
The advent of the electrical telegraph in the 19th century, followed by the telephone grid and eventually coaxial cables.
It's just hard to overstate how deeply this fractured the human experience of time and space. I mean, before the copper telegraph wire, the absolute maximum speed that a piece of information could travel, a declaration of war, a message of love, the outcome of an election, was the physical speed of a galloping horse or a ship catching a good wind. A message from London to New York took weeks.
And suddenly, because we learned to draw this highly conductive metal into thousands of miles of wire, information began traveling at the speed of light.
That's mind-blowing.
Copper effectively shrunk the globe. It converted human society from a reality based strictly on local physical presence into a continuously networked simultaneous existence.
It became the nervous system of the planet. And it's so embedded in everything we do today that economists actually refer to the metal as a living entity. They call it Dr. Copper.
Yes, it earned that moniker because the global price of copper acts as an incredibly accurate diagnostic pulse for the health of the broader world economy.
Because it's used in everything.
Literally everything. It is universally required for construction, manufacturing, power generation, electronics. When the global economy is healthy and expanding, when nations are building new housing grids, manufacturing vehicles, laying down infrastructure, the demand for copper surges and its price climbs.
And when things go bad.
When the economy begins to contract or face a recession, construction slows, manufacturing stalls, and the price of copper drops almost immediately. It is said to be the only metal with a PhD in economics.
That's such a great phrase, but I want to make sure I understand the engineering choices here. We established earlier that silver is actually a better conductor than copper, but it's way too expensive.
Right.
What about aluminum? Because aluminum is cheap, it's abundant, and I know we use it in some power lines. Why isn't it Dr. Aluminum?
Well, aluminum is indeed used for overhead high-voltage transmission lines, and that's because it is incredibly lightweight, which reduces the structural load on the massive steel towers, and it is much cheaper than copper. However, it has serious physical drawbacks that make it dangerous and inefficient for everyday use.
Like what? What makes it dangerous?
Aluminum has lower overall electrical conductivity than copper, meaning you need a significantly thicker wire to carry the same amount of current. But more importantly, aluminum has a high rate of thermal expansion.
Thermal expansion.
Yes. When electricity flows through a wire, it generates heat. Aluminum expands significantly when it gets hot and contracts when it cools. In the intricate, dense wiring inside a house or a complex motor, that constant expansion and contraction can quickly loosen connections.
Oh, and a loose connection with electricity is bad news.
Very bad. A loose electrical connection creates arcing, which causes house fires. Copper, thanks to its density and stability, resists that thermal expansion. It occupies a rare, virtually irreplaceable balance of high conductivity, extreme workability, physical durability, and relative abundance.
So, if Dr. Copper is the pulse of a healthy, growing economy, does our absolute addiction to it mean civilization actually has a chronic condition? I mean, we love to talk about how advanced we are. We talk about the digital age, wireless technology, Bluetooth, storing our lives in the cloud. It sounds so ethereal and weightless.
The concept of the cloud is one of the most successful marketing illusions of the modern era.
An illusion.
Completely. The cloud is not a vapor. It is not weightless. The cloud is agonizingly heavy. The cloud consists of massive, sprawling data centers consuming gigawatts of power. It is vast server farms, endless aisles of printed circuit boards, and thick submarine telecommunication cables resting in the freezing darkness of the ocean floor.
Wow.
And every single inch of that physical infrastructure relies on a metallic skeleton.
The cloud is made of copper. I want that to really sink in for you listening. Every wireless interaction you have, every video you stream, every digital payment you tap, every text message travels wirelessly for maybe a few dozen feet to a router or a cell tower.
At most.
Right. But from that moment on, your data is physically racing through thousands of miles of copper wire. The more wireless we pretend to be, the more intensely we rely on this ancient metal beneath our feet.
Which forces us to look at where that metal actually comes from. Because the gleaming, hyper-connected world we experience above ground is entirely subsidized by a brutal, deeply disconnected world below the ground.
Yes, we have to pivot to the underworld, the mine. Because the metal that connects humanity is extracted through profound physical and social isolation, and the history of getting it out of the rock is just harrowing.
The evolution of copper extraction is a timeline of intense human toll. In antiquity, once the easily gathered surface nuggets were exhausted, miners had to follow the veins deep underground. And before explosives were invented, they used a terrifying technique called fire setting.
Wait, how does fire setting work underground?
Miners would crawl into these tight, suffocatingly dark shafts, stack large amounts of wood directly against the solid rock face containing the ore, and set it on fire.
Inside the tunnel?
Yes. They would let the fire rage until the rock was superheated. Then, they would throw freezing cold water directly onto the blazing stone.
That sounds like a recipe for a bomb.
The immense thermal shock caused the solid rock to violently crack and fracture. Once the smoke cleared and the ventilation was incredibly poor, meaning miners inhaled massive amounts of toxic smoke and dust, they would crawl back in and pry the cracked ore loose by hand with picks and wedges.
That is a psychological nightmare. You're miles underground, the air is thick with smoke, it's blazing hot, and you're intentionally trying to fracture the rock ceiling above your head.
The danger of cave-ins was constant. And as civilization moved into the medieval period, the demand for copper for currency, roofing, and bronze weaponry required much deeper mines.
So it only got worse.
They introduced water wheels and hand-operated pumps to keep the deep shafts from flooding, but the physical toll remained horrific. Look at the mining town of Røros in Norway.
Oh, I looked at the history of Røros in our research. It's an entire town built around copper.
It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site today, but its history is sobering. The copper deposits were discovered there in the 17th century, and from that moment, the mines operated continuously for 333 years.
3 centuries.
Yes, only shutting down in 1977.
Imagine what 333 years of continuous mining does to a community. That is, generation after generation of families living in a frozen, brutal landscape, knowing that every single morning the men and boys are going to descend into the dark. The mine dictates everything. The architecture of the town, the local economy, the lungs of the workers, the class structure.
Yeah, as the Industrial Revolution arrived, the scale of extraction magnified exponentially. Mechanization brought steam engines, railways, and dynamite into the pits. The extraction became faster, but the concentration of workers meant that when tragedies occurred, the loss of life was staggering.
We have to acknowledge some of these historical events because they highlight the true cost of our electrical grid. June 8, 1917. The Granite Mountain Speculator mine fire in Butte, Montana.
A terrible day.
A miner was being lowered down a shaft with a carbide lamp, and he accidentally ignited a frayed, exposed electrical cable. The fire spread with terrifying speed through the heavy wooden timbers holding up the mine shafts. Deep underground, the fire consumed all the oxygen, filling the labyrinth of tunnels with deadly carbon monoxide and smoke.
The men trapped below had almost no warning. 168 miners died, the vast majority of them suffocating in the absolute darkness, unable to find their way to the surface. It remains the deadliest hard rock mining disaster in United States history.
And the terror of the mine wasn't just physical, it was deeply political. In the early 20th century, copper was powering the new telegraph grids and electrifying major cities. The corporations controlling the metal held immense power, but the workers pouring it from the ground were incredibly vulnerable. That same year, 1917, you had the Bisbee deportation in Arizona.
The situation in Bisbee highlights the intense clash between labor and capital. Miners working in the massive copper pits went on strike. They were demanding standard safety regulations, a livable wage, and an end to discriminatory practices against Mexican miners and union members.
Reasonable demands.
Yes, but the response from the mining companies and local authorities was not negotiation. It was militant action.
An armed posse, organized by the local sheriff and backed by corporate interests, illegally deputized thousands of men. They rounded up over 1,000 striking workers and their supporters at gunpoint. They marched them to a rail yard, loaded them into filthy cattle cars, and literally deported them across state lines, dumping them in the middle of the New Mexico desert with a warning never to return.
It is a stark reminder of the political economy of copper. The metal is celebrated for connecting the world, but historically, the entities controlling its extraction have often fought ruthlessly to prevent the workers themselves from organizing and connecting. And we must be clear here, the vulnerability of the mining workforce is not just a relic of the 19th or 20th centuries, it is an ongoing reality today.
Right. When we look at modern extraction, particularly in parts of Central Africa, the human toll is still incredibly present. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, some of the world's richest copper deposits heavily overlap with cobalt deposits.
The humanitarian reports surrounding artisanal mining in the DRC are highly concerning. The U.S. Department of Labor officially lists copper among goods associated with child labor in the DRC. To provide scale, Amnesty International highlighted a 2014 estimate from UNICEF, which stated that roughly 40,000 children were working in mines across southern DRC.
40,000 children.
Yes. These reports describe children, some as young as 7, performing deeply physically demanding work scavenging for ore, washing rocks, carrying heavy loads for long hours, and meager pay in highly unregulated, informal mining sites. The history of copper labor is profoundly stratified.
It always has been.
The hardest, most dangerous physical labor consistently falls to the most marginalized and vulnerable populations, while the technological and economic benefits flow upward to distant manufacturers, tech companies, and consumers.
It makes you reflect on the unique, almost paradoxical psychology of a mining town. There's this intense loyalty among the workers because when you are 2 miles underground, your life literally depends on the person next to you. But that loyalty is mixed with a deep fatalism. A mining town simultaneously loves the mine because it provides the paycheck that feeds their children, and they absolutely hate the mine because it eventually takes their lungs, it breaks their bodies, and it permanently scars the landscape they call home.
And that scarring of the physical environment is profound. The violence of mining doesn't end when the copper is removed. It leaves behind a toxic legacy. One of the most persistent, devastating environmental issues in global copper mining is a phenomenon known as acid mine drainage.
I know this has ruined entire river systems, but how does removing a rock cause a river to turn toxic?
It comes back to the chemistry of the ore.
Yeah.
The majority of the world's major copper deposits are sulfide ores. This means the copper atoms are deeply chemically bonded with sulfur atoms.
Okay.
To get the tiny amount of copper out, you have to blast and excavate millions of tons of surrounding rock. This massive volume of leftover material is called waste rock or tailings, and it is piled up in huge man-made mountains on the surface.
So you have a literal mountain of crushed rock that contains sulfur.
Exactly. When that deeply buried sulfide rock is suddenly brought to the surface and exposed to atmospheric oxygen and rainwater, a natural but devastating chemical reaction occurs. The sulfur reacts with the water and oxygen to create sulfuric acid.
Oh, wow. So the crushed rock itself literally starts bleeding battery acid into the dirt.
It does. And as this sulfuric acid seeps down through the waste piles, it acts as a solvent. It leaches highly toxic heavy metals like lead, arsenic, and cadmium out of the surrounding dirt and carries them directly into local groundwater aquifers and surface rivers.
That's catastrophic.
A tragic example of this is the Ely copper mine in Vermont, which operated heavily in the 1800s. Long after the mine was abandoned, the acid mine drainage continued, severely contaminating local waterways and soil, eventually requiring the EPA to designate it a massive Superfund cleanup site. The landscape is altered twice. First by the violent physical removal of the earth, and second by a chemical reaction that can poison the watershed for centuries after the miners have left.
So next time you slip a light switch or plug your phone charger into the wall, realize that you are standing at the end of a vast supply chain. And historically, the comfort and illumination we enjoy in the modern city is subsidized by the physical danger of the worker in the dark and the permanent scarring of the earth.
Which brings us to perhaps the most urgent and uncomfortable reality of our modern era. The dirty, historically devastating reality of copper mining is currently colliding head-on with our desperate need to save the global climate. We have entered the green energy paradox.
This is the massive bottleneck. We know burning fossil fuels is destroying the climate. We know we have to transition to clean, renewable energy, but we literally cannot build a decarbonized world without digging up the earth on a scale we have never seen before.
It is the defining material challenge of the 21st century. The International Energy Agency, the IEA, projects that if the world is to achieve a net zero emissions scenario, the global demand for copper will rise by roughly 50% by the year 2040.
A 50% increase in just a couple of decades. Why is the jump so massive?
Because a green energy grid is a copper-intensive grid. If you look at an internal combustion engine car, it uses some copper for wiring. But an electric vehicle uses substantially more copper, often 3 to 4 times as much, for the massive battery arrays, the electric motors, the heavy-duty inverters, and the internal wiring.
That adds up fast.
And it's not just the cars. Offshore wind turbines require massive copper coils in their generators and miles of thick undersea cables to bring the power to land. Solar farms require vast networks of copper wiring to connect the panels to the grid. Decarbonizing the planet fundamentally means electrifying the planet, and moving electricity efficiently requires copper.
But getting that massive amount of copper out of the ground requires a staggering amount of energy. Let's talk about how modern ore is actually processed today, because we are no longer talking about guys with pickaxes chipping away at a pure vein of metal.
Not at all. The high-grade, easily accessible copper deposits were exhausted centuries ago. Today, modern mining companies are extracting very low-grade ore. We are talking about rock that contains perhaps half of 1% of actual copper. To get a usable amount of metal, you have to move whole mountains.
So walk me through the mechanics of that. You blast the rock in an open pit, then what?
Massive haul trucks, often the size of houses, carry the blasted rock to crushers. The crushers and grinders pulverize millions of tons of solid rock down to a fine, sandy powder just to physically liberate the microscopic copper minerals from the waste rock. The electricity and diesel fuel required just for this crushing phase is immense.
And once it's powder, how do you separate the copper from the useless sand?
For the sulfide ores we discussed earlier, they use an ingenious chemical process called froth flotation. They dunk the crushed powder into massive tanks of water and add highly specialized chemicals called collectors. These chemicals selectively bind only to the copper-bearing minerals, making them hydrophobic, meaning they repel water.
Okay.
Then they pump air into the bottom of the tank to create bubbles.
So the copper minerals grab onto the air bubbles to get away from the water.
Exactly. The copper-laden bubbles rise to the surface, creating a thick metallic froth, while the worthless rock sinks to the bottom. They skim that froth off the top, dry it out, and that gives you a copper concentrate that is roughly 30% pure.
Which still isn't pure enough to wire a house.
Nowhere near.
Yeah.
That concentrate is then sent to a smelter, where it's subjected to extreme heat to burn off the sulfur and iron, creating what is called blister copper, which is about 98 to 99% pure.
Almost there.
But even 99% isn't pure enough for modern electronics. Impurities create electrical resistance. So it goes through a final stage called electrorefining. They cast the blister copper into massive plates called anodes, lower them into a highly acidic chemical bath, and run a powerful electrical current through the liquid. Over several weeks, the pure copper atoms dissolve into the liquid and migrate over to plate themselves onto a starter sheet called a cathode. The result is 99.99% pure copper.
That is an insane amount of processing. And what about the ores that aren't sulfides? The oxide ores?
For oxide ores, they use a completely different process called SXEW, which stands for solvent extraction and electrowinning. Instead of crushing and frothing, they stack the low-grade ore into massive, sprawling heaps, sometimes miles long. They slowly drip a weak sulfuric acid solution over the top of the heap. As the acid percolates down through the rock over months, it dissolves the copper.
It's like brewing the most toxic cup of coffee imaginable.
That's a vivid way to put it. They collect this copper-rich acid pool at the bottom, use chemical solvents to concentrate it, and then use the electrowinning process, passing a current through it, to plate out the pure copper. It can be more cost-effective for low-grade ores, but it requires the rigorous, flawless management of millions of gallons of highly acidic liquids to ensure it doesn't breach the liners and poison the groundwater.
When you lay out the steps, the explosives, the diesel trucks, the massive electric grinders, the smelting furnaces, the chemical baths, the energy required just to obtain the metal that is supposed to save our energy grid is staggering. And geopolitically, the entire world is relying on just a few specific regions to provide it.
The geography of copper supply is highly concentrated, which creates a very fragile global system. According to the 2026 USGS Mineral Commodity Summary, Chile remains the world's absolute heavyweight producer. They possess these massive, deep, porphyry copper systems in the Andes Mountains. You also have massive production in Peru, the Democratic Republic of Congo, China, and the United States.
Which means this metal carries a massive geopolitical charge. If there is a severe drought in Chile and these froth flotation and SXEW processes require millions of gallons of water, or if there is a major labor strike in Peru or political upheaval in the Congo, the impact isn't local. It ripples instantly through the entire global economy. A strike in a South American mine can literally stall the manufacturing of wind turbines in Europe or electric vehicles in Detroit.
The supply chain is tight and the demand is accelerating. But amid all this heavy extraction and energy use, there is one profound saving grace to the copper story. Copper is infinitely recyclable.
This is the part of the deep dive that gives me genuine hope.
It is the crucial counterbalance. Unlike plastics, which degrade every time you melt them down, or paper, whose fibers shorten and weaken, copper can be melted down and recast an infinite number of times without losing a single fraction of its core properties. Its conductivity and malleability remain perfect. Today, old housing wire, discarded plumbing pipes, industrial scrap, and electronic waste can all be melted down to become fresh copper feedstock.
It forms a circular memory system. I love that concept. It means that the specific copper atoms carrying the current in your brand new EV charging cable might be the exact same atoms that were strung up on a Victorian telegraph pole in 1890, which might have been melted down from a Roman bronze coin from 200 AD. The metal physically remembers us. It stays in the bloodstream of civilization.
It does. And recycling requires only a fraction of the energy needed to mine and process virgin ore, massively reducing carbon emissions and the need for new open pits. However, we have to be realistic. Even if we achieved 100% perfect global recycling rates, the sheer unprecedented volume of new copper required to build the global green energy transition means that massive new mining operations are inevitable.
Okay, let me challenge this entire framework of the green transition. Are we actually creating a greener world, or are we just engaging in a massive global shell game with pollution? Are we just shifting the environmental damage out of sight, moving the carbon smog out of our wealthy cities, and hiding the true cost in massive toxic open pits and tailings dams in the Andes Mountains in the Congo? Is this actually sustainable?
That is the most uncomfortable question copper forces us to confront, and the evidence suggests the answer is profoundly complex. We're undoubtedly shifting both the type and the location of our environmental impact. We are attempting to trade atmospheric carbon pollution, which threatens global climate stability and the very survival of coastal cities, for localized ecological disruption, heavy metal contamination, and massive water usage in specific mining regions.
It's a trade-off.
The clean energy future is not weightless. It has open pits, it requires diesel-haul trucks, and it is fraught with intense labor disputes. The transition isn't about achieving a flawless, impact-free world. That world doesn't exist. It's about navigating brutal, complex trade-offs. It requires a maturity that civilization hasn't always shown. It demands that we enforce better, cleaner mining practices, demand rigorous community consent, ensure ironclad labor protections, and aggressively minimize our wasteful, throwaway consumption of electronics.
So, if you are listening to this, you need to understand that you are living through a civilizational bottleneck. The transition away from fossil fuels is not just about writing new policy. It requires the most massive physical extraction effort in human history. To build a clean, sustainable future, we have to dig up the earth on an unprecedented scale.
Which brings us to our final exploration. We've talked extensively about the geology, the chemistry, the brutal history of the underworld, and the environmental paradox. But to fully grasp the story of copper, we have to zoom out and look at its psychological and cultural resonance. Why does this specific metal feel so deeply alive to us? We need to talk about the soul of civilization.
Yes, because copper doesn't feel cold and industrial like steel, and it doesn't feel immortal, sterile, and untouchable like gold. When you look at ancient mythology, copper wasn't associated with the god of war, like iron was with Mars. And it wasn't the metal of the sun god. Copper was intimately tied to Venus, to Aphrodite.
That association stems partly from geography. Cyprus was both a massive ancient copper source and a region deeply sacred to the cult of Aphrodite. But the connection goes deeper into human psychology and the metal's physical properties. Copper represents beauty, warmth, sensuality, and life. Its reddish-orange hue perfectly mimics the color of human blood, the glow of a warm firelight, and the turning of autumn leaves. Humans instinctively associate those visual cues with vitality, warmth, and intimacy.
It's a metal that breathes, it responds to the environment, it oxidizes, it ages. If you look at a newly minted penny, it has that bright, shiny brown flash. But over time, exposed to the air and the oils on our hands, it turns to a dark brown. And eventually, if left to the elements, it forms that iconic, vivid green patina, the copper carbonate and copper sulfate layer. The Statue of Liberty is the ultimate monumental example of this.
When the Statue of Liberty was first assembled in New York Harbor, it was the color of a shiny new penny. Over a few decades, the harsh, salty harbor air and the pollution of the city chemically reacted with the copper skin. But importantly, it didn't rust away into brittle dust the way iron would have. The copper reacted with the environment to build a protective chemical skin. That green patina seals the metal underneath, preventing further corrosion.
And that transformation gives the metal deep symbolic weight. It visually demonstrates survival. A green copper roof on an old cathedral feels dignified. It shows continuity through time. It proves it has weathered the storm.
Copper also transformed our culture in an entirely invisible way, through the manipulation of sound. We mentioned earlier that alloying copper with tin creates bronze. But the Bronze Age wasn't just about making better swords, it was about acoustic expansion.
Right, bronze makes bells, it makes gongs, cymbals, and horns.
Because of its specific atomic structure and density, bronze has an incredible capacity to project tonal richness and resonance. Before bronze, human music was largely limited to the percussive thud of wood and animal skin, or the soft notes of bone flutes. Bronze allowed sound to ring out. It allowed a sacred bell to carry its tone across an entire valley, calling a dispersed community to worship or warning them of danger. The emotional acoustic range of human civilization literally expanded because we learned how to manipulate copper alloys.
It's the ultimate dual mirror for humanity. When you look at copper, it reflects our absolute greatest achievements: the wiring of life-saving incubators in hospitals, the global communication networks that allow us to share knowledge instantly, gorgeous Renaissance art, and the sacred resonance of a temple bell. And yet, It perfectly reflects our most devastating failures, the forging of deadly weapons, the violent imperialism driven by resource extraction, the scarring of the environment, and the brutal exploitation of marginalized workers. It carries the electricity that powers a ventilator, and it forms the dense brass casing of an artillery shell. Like fire, the metal possesses no morality. It doesn't decide. We do.
That is the essence of it. Copper is the physical body beneath the abstract dream of civilization. We speak of democracy, of love, of global connection, and digital memory as if they are ethereal concepts. But those abstract ideas are carried, transmitted, and stored by the physical reality of ballots, illuminated homes, massive server farms, and thousands of miles of wire.
I always try to summarize it like this. Gold is like a billionaire getting endless plastic surgery to pretend time isn't passing. It refuses to react with the world. It refuses to tarnish. It's sterile. Copper is the person who lets their hair go gray and wears their wrinkles with profound dignity. That green patina shows they've actually lived. They've been out in the weather, they've adapted to the pressure, they've built a shield to protect themselves, and they have endured.
A beautiful synthesis. If we draw all these historical, chemical, and cultural threads together, the core insight of this exploration is that copper is not merely a resource we extract from the ground. It is the physical medium through which we conduct our history, our power, and our consequences. We originally dug it from the earth to extend the reach of our hands with tools, and it ultimately ended up extending our voices across oceans, illuminating our cities, and expanding our imagination. It is a material that is vulnerable, yet enduring, shaped by immense pressure, transformed by fire, and defined entirely by connection.
Connection with deep consequence. I want to leave you with one final image to ponder long after you take off these headphones. Think ahead thousands of years from now. When future archaeologists dig through the geological strata of our era, they won't find the stone pyramids of Egypt or the grand marble temples of Rome defining us. They will dig down and find a fossilized planetary web of green, oxidized copper wires running under our oceans and through the ruins of our walls. And as they hold that green thread, they will wonder, what were we so desperate to communicate with each other? And what were we willing to sacrifice to build a net that wrapped around the entire world? Next time you plug in your phone or simply flip a light switch in a dark room, take a second to think about the ancient red thread humming inside the drywall. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious.